The Bread and Better podcast acknowledges the Yagara people and the Turrbal people as the traditional custodians of Meanjin, the lands on which we record today. We pay our respects to the Yagara and Turrbal elders, past, present, and emerging. This podcast is brought to you by Hey Al Productions.
And then I'm
Did I say good?
Did I get you to do it one more time?
Maybe just in case.
Okay, do it one more time.
Go. Bread and Better podcast.
Okay. Bread and Better podcast. I feel like I am. Bread and Better podcast.
Hello and welcome back to the Bread and Better podcast, where we deliver a weekly chat about the things that affect us as women. I'm Alex, co-host and producer, and Tegan is your other co-host and health guru. Alex and I believe that looking after our mental health is one of our absolute first priorities, and today we are joined by our resident psychologist, Emma Slade, to share with you everything you need to know about finding and seeing a psych. As I have shared before, I have regularly seen a psychologist for a really long time now. However, there are many things that I wish I knew beforehand to streamline the process and remove some of the misconceptions about what it's really like. So I'm really excited about this episode because I think it will be really helpful for our listeners. For those that are long-time listeners, you will already know Emma, but for those that are newer, Emma is a psychologist with 8 years experience. She's a friend of the podcast and has been on 3 times before. We definitely recommend going back and listening to the other episodes that Emma features on. As we mentioned recently, the fantastic episode that she did on anxiety is one of our most listened to episodes ever. So welcome back, Emma.
Hello, everybody. Thanks for having me back.
We'll start our episode with our favourite segment, the best thing that we ate in the last week. And Emma, as our guest, you will go first.
So the best thing I ate in the past week was a homemade cheeseburger. So shout out to my partner for that one. Yeah, last weekend he's like, I'm really craving a cheeseburger, but he's like, I don't want to feel crap after it. So yeah, he went ahead and made those for us. So, and it had the works, everything. And then I added some rocket and tomato because, Tegan and I, shoved the veggies in there, more veggies. Yeah, so that was the best thing I ate.
Yum. I have not eaten anything good for like 3 weeks, which we'll get into in the next episode. We're not going to talk about that today. But the last good thing I ate was when I went out for my birthday dinner with Tegan, and we went to Etsu, a Japanese restaurant on the Gold Coast, and we had heaps of delicious things, but I think my favourite was the pork belly yakitori. It was delicious.
Yeah, that was really good.
Like melted in your mouth.
Yeah, and then I had yochi, and it was really good. Have you had yochi?
No, not yet. I think there's one in Balimba that's just open, maybe.
Yeah, it's very hyped, and I was like not sure, and Alex and I went and I just got the tiniest bit. Alex got a coffee from Starbucks as her dessert. So weird.
It was a caramel. It was like a salted caramel latte, so it's more of a dessert.
Strange. Yochi, really good. I don't think it's overrated. It's nice.
It looked delicious.
Check it out. Yeah. The best thing that I ate in the last week, though, I'm going to pump my own cooking. I made us dinner on Friday night, and we had dumplings with rice and this, I made a red curry sauce.
Yum.
With heaps of shallots. Wouldn't be good for you. And then chili oil.
Yeah.
It was really good. It came out really well. I was really stoked with myself and a glass of red.
Did you make the dumplings?
No.
Oh, okay.
I wished I did. In hindsight, I'd make my own dumplings next time.
I always want to make my own dumplings. I just haven't tried it yet.
I think I've done it before. It's pretty easy. All right, as we said before, thank you again for joining us. Everyone always loves it when you join us, so we are sure that today will be no different. Let's get straight into it and break down some common questions and misconceptions about seeing a psychologist so that any of our listeners that might be putting it off can know what to expect.
Yeah, absolutely. I think first off for today, some of these questions you might not have thought of before, that some of our listeners might not have, realised that other people think about these things. And also to just, I guess it's a bit of a disclaimer that I'm talking from my experience of being a psychologist. Obviously that will reflect a little bit in how I work. Every psych is different. But yeah, again, I think these are some common queries and misconceptions and perhaps concerns that people have about seeing a psych. So on the one hand that they want to see a psychologist, maybe they feel ready to take that step. But on the other hand, there's some barriers or things getting in the way. So hopefully we can debunk some of those today.
So when Tegan and I were talking about this episode in the planning, I said to Tegan that I think that one of the reasons some people haven't seen someone is because it's quite expensive and can be really hard to find someone. So can we start there?
Yeah, absolutely. So maybe we break this down into talking about the expense side of things first. and then how to actually find someone. They're two kind of two questions in one. So first, with the expense side of things, there are a range of services or referrals and plans that can help with that process. So we'll run through some of the most common ones. So first off, there's private health, right? So if you have private health, you might look into that and see that you do have, in fact, some sessions that you can claim with a psychologist. It might be embedded within another allied health profession within that, or you might be able to change your private health if it works for you, if it suits you, to be able to get some rebates there. We then have, I guess, the more medical kind of rebates, if you like. I say medical because your general practitioner or your doctor is really your gateway to receiving those. So what we're looking at there are our mental health care plans and Medicare mental health care plans. There's also an eating disorders version of that. And then we also have an enhanced primary care plan. So I know that's a lot of like technical names and jargon there, but essentially what each of these types of referrals offer you is a certain amount of sessions that you then receive a rebate on. So at the moment, for example, if your GP perceives and assesses that you're eligible for an eating disorder care plan or a mental health care plan, you're looking at around, approximately $95 rebate on each session. Whereas if you look at an enhanced primary care plan, you're looking at around $60 and you get around 5 sessions. So it's really up to your doctor to determine if you're eligible for those. And again, the number of sessions that you get rebated really vary. So for example, with the eating disorder care plan, you're looking at 20 sessions in a year. And that was something that the government introduced a couple of years ago because a lot of research came out and pointed that to provide that quality care in the space of eating disorders, we really need more sessions compared to the standard mental health care plan, which is typically 10 sessions a year. So that's really some of the options through your GP. I think too, having a good relationship with your GP can really help people in having these conversations. Some of my clients don't feel that they can go to their GP and talk about their concerns. So I understand that this can be a little bit taxing. It's a bit of a process to go and find a psych, let alone another GP. But again, if this is something that's been holding you back in having these conversations because you don't want to talk to your GP, perhaps about some mental health concerns, I would really question about seeing that GP. GPs are trained in this space. They're trained to provide these referrals. And really, if we think about it as holistic, healthcare, right, your physical health and mental health are on par. So I think really having those conversations with your GP. One last thing with GPs too is depending on where you're located, you might have access to other sort of government initiatives. So a bit of an example of that is when I used to work out of Brisbane a little bit south of Brisbane, I was in the Metro South catchment. And certain clients with certain presentations and economic status could receive discounted psychology sessions, and Metro South would pick up the rest of that. So again, based off your location, you might also be eligible for different services. So it's really having that conversation. Some other ideas that maybe some people may know about Medicare mental health care plans, so maybe some other options that you might not have heard of. If you live close to a university that offers a master's program in psychology, so where I went to train and where a lot of psychs go, you'll often find that there'll be a psychology clinic linked to that university. So for example, I went to the University of Queensland and there is a University of Queensland psychology clinic. Essentially what happens there is provisional psychologists, so psychologists where we're undergoing our training, offer, quite frankly, really cheap psychology services. So this was back in 2016, 2017 for me, and my sessions were $40.
I did not know this.
Yeah. Good tip. I didn't either.
That's really good.
So I saw, obviously students at the university where perhaps the counselling service offered by the university was maybe not what they were looking for, so they would come and see me. But also people just in the general community that knew about it. Sometimes there are some restrictions, if you're presenting with certain presentations, certain clinical presentations you might be referred on, but it's really worthwhile looking at it because you're working with a provisional psychologist, so they're under training, but essentially you get 2 psychs for the price of 1 because as a provisional psych, while we're getting that training, we have a supervisor, a psychologist who is also a supervisor, and we basically take your case and kind of scurry back to them after session and be like, okay, this is what we discussed.
Yeah.
And they'll go, okay, what's your case formulation? What are you thinking? And we can generate the ideas together. So as a provisional psych, I'm they're giving you the psychology service, but they're working in conjunction with a fully trained psych.
That's so good.
It's a little industry secret.
Right? That makes a lot of sense too, because it's just like when you're in the ED and you see, is it like a register, and then they go and get their supervisor, like interesting.
Yeah. So it's, again, if you live, and that's why I just say, like, if you live in the area, so for example, again, talking about UQ, not to like hype that up, but if you're living in St. Lucia or sort of that side of the city and cost and commute is really important to you, that could be a really good option.
And we've got like Griffith and stuff near us. So Okay, cool. Oh, I love that too.
So generally just go into Google, type in the university, type psychology clinic. If they have one, it'll most likely pop up.
Cool.
Brilliant.
Love that.
What else? On the topic, if you are a uni student, for those listening, you'll often find that your university will offer you counselling/psychology services. So I work at Australian Catholic University as a lecturer, but there we have a dedicated counselling service where students get 6 free sessions per year.
Really?
Yeah. And they can talk about, it doesn't have to be just about your academic concerns. It can be life concerns. It can be absolutely anything. So I say to my students, I'm like, that's why you pay HECS. Like that's your student amenities fee. Like, so you kind of indirectly are paying for it. You might as well use it.
Yeah.
And again, it's a great gateway because they have their networks and connections. So if they feel that they aren't the right fit or they can't provide the therapy that you're looking for that would best suit you, they'll refer you on. Yeah, so I think that's really probably the options that you have for rebates, reduced costs and whatnot. Again, going back to that original question of like, seeing a psychologist, it's so expensive. I'm probably biased because I am a psych. But I guess to break that down for you, what you're paying for in that fee. So a lot of people think, okay, I'm paying X amount of money to go and talk to my psychologist for 50 minutes. And often with psychology services, and this is just services in general, because you're not, I guess, getting a product that you're then grabbing and taking up and taking with you, it can often feel like, where did my money go? Like, where did I it's kind of out in the abyss. I've spent this money. And your psych won't always give you homework as well. So it can kind of give that sense of like, okay, what have I paid for? But that 50-minute, the fee that you're paying is not just for the 50 minutes. So it's for that time and it's for that session, but it's also for the amount of time that the psychologist spends in preparing for your case. So after we see a client for the first time, we go away and formulate the case. We map it all out. We, fill in what we call our 5 Ps, right? And start to get a sense of what's happening for this person. And then for the second session, what are the missing pieces here? What do I need to try and establish? And what am I thinking from like a therapeutic standpoint? Like what's the therapy that the evidence and the research says that will most likely help this presenting concern, but also to what do I think is going to work for this client? So we spend a significant amount of time formulating that as well as writing our notes. Any psychs listening will understand that we hate writing our notes. It's probably the real downside of the job, but we spend time doing that as well. And then the prep for the next session, right? So before every session, I'm looking back over my case notes. I'm readjusting or reminding myself, okay, where are we at? What do we need to fill in? What are my objectives for this session? But perhaps what are my client's objectives or goals? So there's an incredible amount of time that goes into that.
And I think you've just got to think about your return on investment being the improvement in your mental health. And, you know, you can't really put a price on that.
Yeah, I think it's really important for people to keep in mind that the psychology sessions are a little bit like anything that you're doing in regards to health and fitness. Okay, so if you potentially cut your calories for a week, right, or you go to the gym for a week, you might start to see some minuscule changes, but you're not going to see the real benefit until you do that consistently over time. And it's very much the same with psychology sessions. Sometimes you'll come out of a session and kind of feel like, I don't really know, what was happening there, or I wasn't given any homework, or what the point of that session was. And sometimes you can raise that with your psychologist, but it's about the consistency of the sessions over time. They kind of build upon one another. Sometimes you'll come out of a session and be like, oh my God, that was just like light bulb epiphany moment. Like I never realized that, and I've connected the dots, and wow, that's really impactful and powerful right then and there. But it's the I guess you can kind of say it's the journey of the psychology sessions as a whole, not just the once-offs.
Yeah, you're not going to have the epiphany every week.
Yes.
Or every month.
Just like, you
don't drop,
you don't
weight
drop
every week. Yeah.
the same amount of weight every week or whatnot.
You don't get muscles overnight.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Also, keeping in mind the fee that you're paying to see your psychologist is also for the professional work that they're doing outside of your sessions. So as an example, I sought a session with one of my psychologist friends that I went to uni with for supervision on a case. And so, of course, I paid her.
Yeah, right.
I paid her the same amount as what my client paid me.
Yeah.
Right. So it's, again, with that collaboration piece. And then your psychologist will inform you of that if they're seeking supervision with another psychologist, and is that okay? And they're not going to state your name, right? They're going to preserve your confidentiality. But your psychologist is doing work on the outside of the session as well for the benefit of your sessions.
Yeah.
And any continuing professional development courses that they do.
And I think what you've got to keep in mind as well, and this is the same for my business and how much I charge as well, you're not paying for my time, you're paying for my experience, you're paying for my knowledge, you're paying for all the training I've done, and you're paying for my ability to get you the result.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, when we look at psychologists, again, often it feels like you're sitting down and having a chat. It's not a chat for your psychologist there. The way I describe it to people is when I'm sitting there with a client, I've got about 5 different cogs turning in my head for that 50 minutes.
Lots of tabs are open.
There's lots of tabs open, and there's, this is probably a podcast topic for another time of what a psychologist actually does and that process. It's very nuanced, and it's, again, there's lots of cogs sort of turning or plates spinning for me.
Yeah.
And it takes a long time to become a psychologist.
Yeah.
Where you're looking at minimum 6 years of training.
Yeah.
So it's a lot of time that we've spent honing in on this profession and dedication and whatnot.
Yeah. And people don't really question the fees of surgeons, do they? And that's about the same.
Yeah.
Is that about the same sort of length of training? But
that's what my mum said. She's like, you could have been a doctor by now.
That's so funny. I just thought of another one as well, just quickly, and this came to mind when you're talking about uni students being able to get access workplaces as well. I know at Kev's works, you can access completely free psychology as much and as often as you want. So I think some big companies like that offer it as well.
Yeah, that would definitely be worth looking into.
Yeah, that EAP programs.
Yeah,
for sure.
Yeah.
And again, some people don't always feel comfortable seeking that in their workplace because they want to keep that part of their life separate.
Yeah.
But again, that is something that you could probably raise with a psychologist in the EAP setting. Like any field, once you've worked in it for a while, it's pretty small, and psych's no psychs, and we have our referral networks and whatnot. So they might be able to suggest someone.
Yeah.
And I'm sure that there would be so much confidentiality around that with their HR and, whoever you go to. And it's not like you'd be like, oh, Alex, so-and-so told me that you're seeing the psych at work.
Yes.
That would be so much legality around that.
Absolutely.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
So moving into the second part of the question now, how do we find one? How do we find you guys?
Yeah, absolutely. So again, this is how I would go about it. I really start off with the logistical side of things, because if a psychologist is too hard to get to, right, or it's not what you're looking for, you're already establishing barriers to going, right? So thinking about the logistical side of things. So maybe even just noting it down in your phone to sort of answer these questions. It's, how far are you willing to travel for a face-to-face session? Are you looking for someone that's located close to your workplace or close to where you're living? Or what's the sort of the radius or distance on a Google map that you'd be willing to travel?
Yeah.
Are you looking for someone or a psychologist who offers after-hours sessions or weekend appointments? Because not all psychs will. Are you looking for a psych who identifies as being male or female? Right? And these are really common preferences that people have. So taking a note of those things. I guess some maybe perhaps more advanced sort of questions is sometimes people know the type of psychologist they want to work with, right? So, for example, the client themselves might know that I have a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder and I want to work with a psychologist who predominantly works in that space.
Yeah.
So you're noting your preference there for a psych who works predominantly in that area. Again, on top of that, not everyone will know this, but some clients will know the type of therapy that they want or that they prefer. So, for example, as client might know that I'm experiencing depression and I know that cognitive behaviour therapy has worked for me in the past with a previous psych, but I don't live in the same city as them, so I want to seek a psychologist who offers that.
Yeah.
Again, if you don't know the therapy types, though, that's okay. That's for your psychologist to determine.
And you did kind of go through what those different types of therapy were in our anxiety episode, so people could go back and listen to that as well.
Yeah, and there's pretty common ones. Cognitive behaviour therapy, right, has the most research behind it in regards to different life experiences. Acceptance and commitment therapy, but there's a whole host.
Yeah.
There's schema therapy, psychoanalysis,
The light
gestalt
one?
gestalt therapy, EDMR.
Yeah.
Is that a band? I don't know. I'll try the music. Oh my goodness. Rapid eye desensitization, or
Yeah.
obviously you can tell I don't offer that. But yeah, and that's a specific training. Yeah, so if you were looking for someone to offer that to you, not every psychologist would offer that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Once you have that type of info and you've collated that, I really recommend people to go to Google, right, and do a Google search. And I know that kind of sounds a little bit mundane, but typing those things in, so like psychologist, suburb, what the presentation is, anxiety, male, female, whatever the keywords are, and start to have a look around on Google Maps as to where they're located. Mm-hmm. Just a word of warning with Google reviews. Google reviews in the world of psychology, I wouldn't say that they're overly reliable. The reason for that is, first off, a psychologist shouldn't be accepting Google reviews because we can't have testimonials from people who have seen us.
Yeah.
And that's because that relationship with the psychologist is so, not only is it so important, but it's so individualized to the therapist or the psychologist and that person. And there's a lot of research out there that shows that relationship, so what we call the therapeutic alliance between client and clinician, psychologist, is more impactful above any other of the therapy types that we use, right? So even if your psych is using cognitive behaviour therapy and that's the evidence-based approach for your presentation, if you don't have the therapeutic alliance and the rapport there, it's probably not going to work, or you're just not going to get as great a benefit as you could.
Yeah.
So going off Google reviews, it will probably establish that they're a nice person, right? But people, just be mindful that when clients are making those Google reviews, it's very individual to them.
Yeah.
Right? Mm-hmm. It's not like, again, you're just buying, I don't know, a PlayStation off the rack and then going like, this PlayStation is better because I can use these consoles, like a product.
Yeah.
It's very specific to the person. So Google reviews, kind of just go around those and start exploring the website, right? Do you like the sound of the psychologist's bio?
Yeah.
And what they've had to say there? Now, this sounds really judgmental, but do you like the look of the psychologist?
Yeah. Yeah.
And again, there's a bit of research behind this from a neuropsych perspective that they're not so much judgments, like you're not judging the person, but you're starting to assess, is this someone that I could connect with as far as a stranger, where I would walk in and feel comfortable as you can feel in that initial session, those first few sessions, to open up about your life.
I've done that before, definitely.
Yeah.
Like when I've gone through, I was looking for a new psychologist recently and I went through the page and I was like, no, they don't look friendly. They don't look friendly. They don't look friendly. And then I was like, oh, she looks friendly, but not like a hippie. So
And your criteria of who looks friendly would be different to mine.
to someone. Yeah, absolutely.
Just to take it back, I haven't seen anyone. I was under this understanding that it's just like incredibly hard to get into anyone, let alone have this much preference. Is that kind of a misconception?
I wouldn't say it's a misconception. We certainly have wait lists. I think as a whole in Australia, we're short on psychologists. And I often know of GPs sort of really struggling to find psychs on behalf of their clients. That's where I really encourage to maybe, I can't really put a number on it, but I would be calling up. If you're at that point, you're like, I want to make psychology appointment, go through these steps. Maybe have your preferences, like your top 3 to 5 psychologists.
Contact a lot of them.
Calling.
Contact all of them.
Yeah, okay.
Make appointments, jump on wait list.
Okay.
Check the cancellation policies of the psych.
Yeah.
Right? So make sure you've got it noted down that, if you've made an appointment with psychologist 1 or psychologist 3.
Cancel by this date.
And then psych 2 says, hey, I've had an opening, like come in tomorrow and you can do it. Just make sure you cancel the other one.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, like if, the times where I've had my receptionist say, John Smith was meant to come in 2 weeks has cancelled. And I'm like, oh, did they state why? Oh, because he found someone else earlier.
Yeah.
I'm like, great.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like
Exactly.
if I can't cater to you in that time frame and someone else can, I'm not going to be like, oh, well, John Smith, like how rude.
Yeah.
I'm going to be like elated. That's great. That's brilliant.
Yeah.
So that's where jumping on wait lists to give yourself that best chance of getting in.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, that's good advice.
Yeah, that is really good advice.
I think the final couple of points is that if you do receive a plan from your GP and they note a psychologist on there, you don't have to see that psych.
Yeah.
That's purely because part of the Medicare referral process is that when the GP generates the plan, they have to put a psych name on there and an address, but you don't have to see that person. If you choose not to, you just take that plan elsewhere. You know, if you've had, if you've had 1 or 2 sessions with that psych and you choose to take it elsewhere, you just tell your next psychologist that I've already claimed 2 sessions.
So you get that referral from your doctor. It'll have this psychologist's name on it, but you can take that referral and you can go put yourself on 10 wait lists.
Correct.
Yeah.
And you should.
Yeah, and I think you should. Yeah, absolutely.
And
Okay.
do you have to ask your GP for a physical copy of that plan?
Yeah, it's good. It's good if you can get a copy
Yeah.
or electronic copy because if you start to go to different psychs, like you put your name out there and you're on different appointment books, then when you rock up, you can just give it to the psych straight away.
Yeah, because I know I found it really difficult when I think it's a lot harder to find a psychiatrist, isn't it? Yeah. So when my GP referred me to a psychiatrist, the first one that she referred me to had like a year waiting list. And then every time I found someone else, I had to call the admin and be like, can you get her to refer me to this person instead?
Yes.
But then when I saw a different GP, she's like, I'm just going to give you the letter and you can call around. Yeah.
I have another question. It's all related. So you get the referral from your GP if you're going to go on the Medicare health plan. If I don't have a referral, can I book a psychologist appointment?
Yes, absolutely. Seeing a psychologist in Australia, you can do that right off the bat by yourself. You don't need a mental health care plan. You don't need private health.
You can just book it.
You can just book it yourself privately. You just call up, make a session, pay the fee. Happy days.
Yeah.
And that's really where, I have had some clients who are like, look, I'm eligible for a Medicare plan, but I haven't spoken to my doctor about it and I just want to get started and I don't have private health.
Yeah.
So they're just footing the bill themselves. Yeah. So you don't need to have a referral to see a psych.
Okay, good to know.
I had wanted to add something to that quickly. And it's if you're pregnant and you're having like mental health issues, I think it's really important to bring it up to your midwife because if you're in the public system, you can access free psychology through the hospital.
Yes.
Yeah, you don't have to go through because, with all of my pregnancies, I got to see a psychologist throughout my whole pregnancy through the hospital. So
there's a lot of free, there's a lot of free programs and group sessions and whatnot out there.
Yeah.
But it's really about broaching it with your GP and then doing a bit of research yourself. So those key terms in Google.
Yeah.
Belmont Hospital is a great example.
Yeah.
Belmont Hospital, what you're looking for, mindfulness sessions or whatnot. Again, I'll go back to my experience at the UQ Psych Clinic where I was doing one-on-one sessions. But then also me and a fellow provisional psych, we ran a mindfulness course for about 6 weeks in group sessions. So again, and that was some of the clients were also seeing some of our other provisional psychs, but some of them were just from the community and wanted to learn more.
Yeah.
Yeah, like Michelle did the
ADHD.
did the ADHD course at Belmont and she was saying that there's all these brilliant courses that they offer as well.
Yeah.
So next question is, what is the difference between a psychologist, a psychiatrist and a counsellor and how would someone know which one they need to see?
Okay, so 3 different professions here. So let's go through the differences. So first of a psychiatrist. So a psychiatrist first and foremost is a medical doctor, right? So they have gone to university and become a doctor. They then branch off into psychiatry. From a base kind of understanding or level, psychiatrists look at mental health concerns, disorders and conditions from that really neuropsych biological level, right? And they have a script, so they're able to provide medication, right? So they're altering the mental health concern through medication. Would also say that probably what we've seen the psychiatry landscape change a little bit, probably over, roughly 10, 20 years, where more psychiatrists are also becoming dual trained in therapy, right? So sometimes you'll find a psychiatrist that, yes, offers the medication, but they also offer things like cognitive behaviour therapy or different types of therapies, potentially with the conditions that they work most with or presentations they work mostly with.
That seems to make sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, and
Two birds, one stone.
I think there's a little bit of a stigma about psychiatrists that you go in there, they ask you 21 questions, tick and flick.
And they just give you medication.
Yeah, and it feels really impersonal. And I've had clients say that where they're working with me, they go and see a psychiatrist, they come back and they're like, my goodness, like that was not what I was expecting. It's so different from seeing you. Yeah. And I'm like, yeah, that's because they've got a very medical line job to do. They're looking at it very objectively. But again, if you find someone that also offers that therapy, you might not need a psychologist depending on your presentation and what's best for that.
So if you have a mental health condition that requires medication or that you want to be medicated for, you might need to see both.
You might need to see both, yeah. And it's the medication field, and again, it's a little, I have to be careful, it's a little bit outside my scope because as a psychologist, I don't have access to a script.
Yeah.
I can't tell you what antidepressant to take. But there's probably a bit of a sliding scale there. So you can go to your general practitioner and they can offer, SSRIs or different types of antidepressants.
That was going to be my next question. Yeah,
Yeah,
I was just thinking about people that I know that I'm sure have been prescribed antidepressants through their doctor.
Yeah, I got antidepressants through my doctor.
Yes.
And then...
But then you'd see a psychiatrist for, and I don't want to say more serious, that's not the right word, for...
Yeah, for like...
More complex.
Yeah, more complex presentations. I've also had instances where the GP has provided medication to the client and the client's really ambivalent about taking the medication. They're not sure if that's the way that they want to go. And when we have a discussion about it, they kind of say to me, I would feel more supported if I was working with someone who specialises in medication because I'm a little bit fearful of it. I'm not sure if it's the option. That's when we start to look at psychiatry. And again, those more complex presentations where perhaps, I've been working with someone for quite some time and then they're also taking medication, but we're not seeing the traction or any kind of movement in their symptoms. It starts to point to me that, okay, maybe we need a psychiatrist in this space to assess, are they on the right medication, the right dosage, and what does this look like? I think on the topic too of medication, when people are being really ambivalent about it, so they're like, oh, I don't know if I want to take medication or if this will just get better by itself or just with working with you, like it's, they kind of feel a little bit stuck with it. I think there's some really important questions to be asking whoever is providing you with this medication. Right, if I start this medication, how long will it take before I should start to see any improvement, if any improvement is going to occur?
Yeah.
Right. For some people, it's not instant. For some people, it takes 6 weeks. Right. Sometimes a medication is prescribed. They're on it for 4 weeks. They're like, this is just not working. And that's because you need to change the type of medication. Sometimes GPs talk about that. Often what I find though is that the exit plan is not spoken about.
Yeah.
So that is when I get to a point in my life perhaps where I feel I've done the therapeutic work, I've now got the skills and strategies, I feel better within myself. I now want to start to try to live life without medication or reducing that medication. What is the exit plan? Right? Because like any medication to do with anything, often can't just go cold turkey on it, right? Or depending on the medication, it might not be advised. So what is the exit plan coming off that?
That's good. That's a really, really good point.
I just wanted to add to that quickly. I have always seen a psychologist as I've seen a psychiatrist as well, because though I love the practicality of a psychiatrist and I love like the science and them explaining to you like this is what's happening to your brain and this is the medication, I think that to get to a point where you can assess all of the other things, I feel like it's really beneficial to see a psychologist.
Yeah, and it's really common that if someone is seeing a psychiatrist, they're also seeing a psychologist.
Yeah.
So psychiatrists have that medical background first and foremost. They take that biological approach. This is what's happening, as you said, in your brain. This is what the medication would do. On the other hand, a psychologist, so while we don't have a script, we can't offer medication, we work with people across the whole spectrum of mental health.
Yeah.
Right. So a lot of people go, oh, I don't need to see a psychologist, like I don't have a mental health concern. And it's like, no, but you have mental health.
Yeah.
Right? Everyone has mental health.
Yeah.
And there's a real sliding scale there where we can think about on one end of the mental health spectrum where you're thriving, right? And thriving does not mean that you have no issues in your life. Thriving means that, you're living this full and abundant life and that when you experience stress or you experience challenges, you're able to cope with that. You're able to respond to that appropriately, right? So it's not saying that you've got no issues in your life. A tier down from that is coping. right? So that is when, again, life is giving you, quite frankly, like a whole lot of shit, right? And you're not coping with it. You're really struggling, right? You're not sleeping well. You're not eating well, perhaps relying on like maladaptive coping strategies, and you're just getting by. We then slide down into that surviving, right? Which is, the name suggests, is that we're getting through each day. That's about it. Right? And then we go into more of that mental health concern and disorder landscape, where it's like, okay, your experience is leading to significant dysfunction in your life. It's getting in the way of you leading the life that you want. So psychologists are trained to work across that whole spectrum. So yes, we can work with people in the clinical space of assessing and providing a diagnosis if that is appropriate. So I work in that space. I work with people who have a clinical diagnosis, all the way back to people who are really lost, right? They're at a point in their life where they're like, look, I just, maybe they're having a bit of a crisis, or an identity crisis, existential crisis. They've experienced grief and loss. They're struggling with life adjustments. To go back to the pregnancy point, like often in life we experience really positive things in our life, like getting a new job, getting a promotion, buying a house, having a baby, whatever's happening for you. And then people feel a little bit conflicted because they're like, this is meant to be a really happy point in my life. And on the one hand, I'm happy. But on the other hand, I am not coping.
Yeah.
And I think, again, just to debunk that, that's where a psychologist can help you with that really deep understanding of human behavior and the complexity around that. And it's not always about the strategies. Like, yes, there are strategies in place, but it's also seemingly the subconscious work, right? So sometimes with my clients, I'm like, your quote unquote homework for this week or the next fortnight is to see where this conversation that we've had today pops up in your life, and then come back and tell me about it.
Yeah.
Right? Because a lot of the work is done outside of the 50-minute session.
And I'm sure that anyone on that scale at any point could benefit.
Yeah, 100%.
Like, even if you're thriving, I'm sure that there are things to talk about.
Absolutely. So if I go more towards, and we'll get into the different types of psychologists in a moment, but if I talk about being a sport and exercise psychologist, I'm often working with athletes who are in their prime.
Yeah.
They are at the peak, the pinnacle.
Yeah.
Their life is like, it's all moving forward.
Yeah.
But the question is, how can I drop a millisecond off my time? What are the mental strategies? Because my nutrition, my training, my sleep, all of these other things from a physical perspective and a training and a physiological standpoint are on point, the best that they've ever been.
Yeah.
So how do I train this guy up here to get me to that next level? Right? So I'm not working with someone who's coping. I'm working with someone who's thriving.
Yeah.
And that's really, you don't have to be an athlete to experience that.
Yeah.
I would also say too, we'll get to this a little bit later on about like sessions, number of sessions and whatnot, but that's often where sometimes we see people drop out of psychology sessions.
Yeah.
Is, life's great now, problem solved, I feel good, pack her up, she's done. Right?
Tools down, boys.
Tools down. Right.
I'm fixed.
I'm fixed, yes. But I really encourage my clients, it's like when you are feeling well, that is also the time to come to your sessions.
Yeah.
Because the amount of work that you can then do, you're working from a different place, right? If you think about going into a psych session and you're struggling and then you have to talk about the things that you're struggling with, and then your psychologist, gives you maybe some strategies for you to go and try, that's really hard work.
Yeah.
If you think even about the case of like major depressive disorder, it was enough for you to even get your butt in there to sit down, and that's it. Like that's all your capacity gone.
Yeah.
Compared to if you're thriving and you're sitting in front of a psychologist, like you think about the amount of work that you could do from that point. It's different. You see things from a different perspective. So that's why I really encourage people that, again, it's not just about, it's about being in the hardest point of your life.
Yeah.
And a psychologist can work with you in that space. But it's also about working with someone. It's like, okay, how do I make the better even greater?
Yeah.
Love that. I love that.
Yeah, me too.
So the different types of psych, so just give a quick rundown of this, because again, different psychologists can offer different things. So we've spoken about a provisional psych. So that's a psychologist who's in training, whether they're at a university. There's a couple of different pathways. Again, that's a whole different podcast. But whether they're at a university or they're doing on-site training, whether they do a master's degree or they do on-site training, every psychologist comes out as what we call a general psychologist, no matter what their degree or training was in.
Yeah.
Okay, so general psychologists, and they can work across the board. From there, there's an additional what we call 9 endorsement areas in Australia, so 9 different types of psychologists. And that's where we've done, on top of the 6 years, we've done up to another 2 years of supervised work. Okay, so to rattle those off, I've got them written down because I can never remember them all. So, of course, a sport and exercise psychologist is one. A clinical psychologist, so a lot of people have heard of probably a clinical psychologist. So again, they've done additional training. We also have a health psychologist, a counselling psychologist, a clinical neuropsychologist, a community psychologist, an educational and developmental psychologist, a forensic psychologist, and an organisational psychologist.
Right.
So as the name suggests, I won't go into detail of all what they do, but they have done specific additional supervised work in those areas. At the end of the day, though, it's really about, again, finding the psychologist and them informing you if they are competent enough to work with your presentation.
Yeah.
So just to clarify that, I'm a general psych and then a sport and exercise psychologist. If I have someone come to me and they're like, look, I've had this diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder. This is a little bit of my background. Like, can I work with you? Yes, I'm trained to work in that space, but I wouldn't say I'm the most competent psychologist in that space.
Yeah.
Purely because I don't work with that presentation often. Okay. And that's where I go, look, yes, I can work with you if you feel that I'm the right fit, or I can find a psychologist for you who predominantly works in this space and has the really nuanced understanding of that. Then we have a counsellor. So the big difference between counsellor and psychologist, one of the big differences is that to be a psychologist, that's a legally supported term, if you like.
Yeah.
Right? So not everyone can call themselves a psychologist. You have to go through a regulated degree or process of training to be given that title, and it's a protected title. Right, so the psychology field is highly regulated. So each year when we have to pay our fee to be and have that registration, we have to go through a series of questions. Right, so things like, do we have a criminal record in the past 12 months? Anything that gets in the way of being a psychologist, X, Y, and Z. So there's a lot of checkpoints there. Counselling is not a regulated field within Australia, right? So that's not to say that there aren't some brilliant counsellors out there, and you can go to university and do a master's in counselling. So again, it suggests that they've gone through those different steps, and within the counselling space, there are different bodies that counsellors can sign up with to kind of put forward that they have done the training.
Yeah.
Right? I guess from a therapeutic standpoint, the big difference is that counsellors can't assess and diagnose, right? So that's one difference. And they tend to lean more into what's called talk therapy, right? So you've got some stresses, some things going on in your life. You want to see someone, have a chat about it, have a bit of a sounding board, come up with some solutions and strategies, right? So again, a counsellor can offer that, but if you're looking for more of a mental health and maybe leaning into that clinical space, you'd probably go more towards a psychologist. Same with a counsellor though. If you want to see a counsellor, you can look up universities that offer masters in counselling, and they'll often have counselling services at a reduced rate. So that's another really good option.
So why would you see a counsellor and not a psychologist? Is that like kind of if it's less serious and you just want to chat to someone?
Yeah, I don't know if it's less serious.
Yeah.
I think it's that if you feel that you want the space to talk, because that can be really important for people that, they come in and they're like, I just don't have anyone to talk to
Yeah.
about this. And I want a space where I can talk freely and have a bit of a sounding board.
With no judgment.
With no judgment, that really non-judgmental space. So that's probably when you would lean more to a counsellor.
Yeah.
Again, a psychologist can also offer that too. Like as a psychologist, I'm not sitting there and assessing every client that comes in and going, oh, there must be a diagnosis here.
Yeah.
Right? I've had clients before where they come in and again, it's very much, you look like a nice person on your profile. This is my problem. I can't talk to those people about this because it has to do with them. And it's very what we call solution-focused therapy, where it's like, okay, let's find a solution.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's what we need here.
I'm sure a lot of people might be hesitant because they are worried that a psychologist might think that their issues are silly or trivial. So what do you say about that?
That's a really common thing that I hear before that prefacing. I want to tell you something, but you might think I'm really silly. Keep in mind that as part of our training, we're taught to really provide that non-judgmental, compassionate space. for whatever you bring into the session. Again, too, it's never a comparison between clients, right? We don't, have one client come in and they talk about their concerns, and then the next client comes in and I kind of think, oh, well, in compared to the other person, these aren't really issues, right? Because it's relative to the individual, right? It's your own lived experience. So we're trained to really provide that non-judgmental space where you hopefully can feel safe enough to say the things that you might feel are trivial or silly. One thing that, when we're talking about the podcast, and I was, again, thinking about clients who come in and go, oh, you might think I'm silly. I'm kind of like, well, try me.
Yeah.
Because I haven't heard anything yet where I've been like, oh, this is ridiculous. Like, this isn't really a problem. Like, if it's an issue for you.
It's an issue.
It's an issue. Let's validate that. And sometimes just having it validated, it's like, oh, yeah, okay. And sometimes too, like if clients, talking about something, part of a psychologist's job too is to challenge our clients. We're not going to challenge you right from the outset. But again, after a few sessions, when we've built that rapport, if you present something and I'm like, hang on a second, like, the other person that's involved in this scenario that they're potentially talking about, like what's their viewpoint? As a psychologist, I can bring that up.
Yeah.
Right? And again, that's not dismissing how you feel or saying that what you've got to say is silly, but that's what, again, psychologists call like challenging our client, like challenging them to think from different perspectives. It's totally okay to go into your psychologist and disclose everything, right? It's really kind of great.
Yeah.
But when people come in, they're just like, right, it's kind of just like disclosure vomit. Hopefully no one's eating while they listen to this. But it's like, this is it. This is everything, like blah, 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 blah. But it's also okay to meet with your psychologist and not tell them everything up front.
Yeah.
Because everything comes out in the wash eventually.
That's what I was just about to ask. Can you, do you have a bit of a gauge now when you can tell people are obviously not disclosing something or lying about something or?
I think what tends to happen is that over time across sessions, things don't add up. It's kind of like, and I firstly look at that when I'm formulating, I'm like, something just doesn't add up here. On the one hand, the client has said this and then in a different session they've said that. And those two things are a little bit incongruent. And that I come from the perspective of like, I've missed something here. It's not necessarily that the client's lying to me. Like,
or maybe they're not like able to be honest with themselves about it
and they might not be ready.
Yeah.
Right? And that's really, as a psychologist, we are constantly honing in, and that's one of those, like I said before, one of those cogs that turn. And it's like, when can I potentially broach this with the client? Is this appropriate? Is this beneficial to them? Is this client perhaps not ready to hear this? And we're always checking in with that rapport gauge, and some clients come in and they're ready to be challenged. Yeah. They're like, hey, give it to me, like.
Hit me with it.
Hit me with it, right? If you see incongruencies, I don't say that word, but, if you see incongruencies in how I'm presenting, like I want to know.
Yeah.
But of course, not every client is going to front up with that. But yeah, I think it's just more that over time, I kind of sit back and I'm looking at it going, I've missed something here. Like there's something missing or whatnot. And it's really then about, again, just thinking it through and maybe running it through past a supervisor and going, look, is this just me? What are you thinking? Like, what are some areas that maybe I haven't explored or things I've missed? And then gently starting to broach that. But it's psychology is, as much as a psychologist can ask questions and do the therapy, it's also up to the client if they're ready. And if they're not ready, that's okay. It's how it works.
So true, right? No one makes any real change until they're ready to.
Yeah, and as a psychologist, one of the things I teach out at ACU is motivational interviewing. It's like how to work with people who are ambivalent about change, about whatever it is in their life. And that can also be, the change can be engaging with therapy, right? So it's like that we have strategies and things that we can lean upon, but at the end of the day, working with a psychologist is not, me as the psych just pulling you and reefing you along. That's not really how it works. It's taking those steps together and as you're ready, revealing more and more about the scenario. I think sometimes too that if you do have things that you want to tell your psychologist but you're just not sure yet, is voicing that to them. I've had plenty of clients do that where they go, look, there's something about, my past that I want to tell you, but I'm just not sure if I'm ready to.
Yeah.
All right, and then we just explore that. It's like, okay, like what does that kind of, you don't have to tell me the scenario, but tell me about the feelings at the moment around potentially telling me or not telling me. And it's just through those conversations that then the therapy sessions evolve over time.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, this is a perfect segue to the next question. Can you share a little bit about what happens in a session? Is there a sofa to lie on like in the movies?
Yeah. That's one of the most common questions I get asked when people go, oh, you're a psychologist. Like, do you have a lounge? I'm like, no, I don't. Start off with where the sofa concept comes from is Freudian psychology. So Freud or Freud, however you want to pronounce it. Let's just say this old guy psychologist, right, who created a type of psychoanalysis. And through that particular therapy style, lying on the sofa was seen as the best way for the client to be able to relax and engage in that therapy. And to this day, some psychologists will still have a lounge or a sofa. So if you walk into the room and you see a lounge or a sofa, you don't have to lie down, right? You just, when you go to the beautician and they're like, lay down, take your top off, and you're like, oh, what do I do? Like, it's really awkward the first time. So you could just ask, be like, you can just sit down and be like, make a bit of a joke about it. But, some psychologists to this day will still use that because the idea of laying down on a sofa is, first off, you're not facing the psychologist, so it can feel less intimidating and can also promote that sense of relaxation to then be able to dive into some really difficult topics. It's not that common now, but it still does exist.
I got so excited when I saw Freud in your notes. I was like, oh, we're getting into it.
Yeah. Maybe we can do a podcast on like different complexes and whatnot. It's
my God, I would love that.
Pretty strange stuff, but no, it's interesting. So what does a session look like? Your initial session will be a little bit different to your subsequent session. So initial session, and again, this is just the way that I do it. I welcome the client to the space. We have a bit of chit chat. And then it's really about me getting through the admin type of stuff. And what that discussion really focuses in on is the confidentiality, right? So the psychology space is confidential and everything that the client says in the room is confidential, but there's obviously limits to that, right? So, for example, if we feel that our client is at harm to themselves or someone else, then we could breach that confidentiality to keep those people safe.
Yeah.
I think about the instances in where I've had to do that, and again, this is just my approach as a psychologist. I always do my best, though, to keep my client informed of that process. And the same too with if my notes are ever subpoenaed by the court. So the court will say, hand over all your notes. A little bit of a loophole there is that if I hand over my notes, it probably isn't going to make much sense to the court, right? Because I'm talking about, psychoanalysis and acceptance and commitment therapy, and we use, this diffusion technique and leaves on the stream. Like, that's not going to mean much to the court.
Yeah.
As a psychologist, instead, I will offer to write a report.
Yeah.
And again, I keep the client in the loop with that. Yeah. I let them know. And again, any times that I've had things fall outside of that scope where, I've had an example of a client where their workplace wasn't work cover case and the workplace wasn't paying for the sessions, but I had someone from that company's HR contact me asking questions about sessions.
Yeah.
And my receptionist was quite good in that you can email Emma about her work, but I can neither confirm or deny whether this client is a client of ours.
Yeah.
Because it's like, I don't know who this person is.
No.
I'm not telling them anything.
Yeah.
And then I just went straight to the client. It's like, hey, look, this is what happened. What do you know about this? And then from there, I was able to address it. So yeah, I think as a psychologist, not to, talk myself up, but I very much veer on the ethical side of things, and I try and keep my client informed as much as possible.
Yeah.
So the first session really revolves around getting that admin stuff and side of things done. We can talk about the amount of sessions and what that might look like. I also say to my clients, and I didn't mention this before, but I also say to my clients that, look, after a couple or a few sessions, if you feel that I'm not the right fit for you, right? So whether that's quite outrightly you just don't like me, that's okay. We're not born to love everybody. Or that you feel that the therapy that I'm offering and the plan is not the right fit for you, I really encourage you to tell me that. And that can seem really, really daunting, right? And particularly if I'm working with a client who calls himself a people pleaser, they're probably not going to tell me that they're unhappy with me, right? So I understand that's a really challenging space. But again, it goes back to that therapeutic fit. If I'm not the right fit for you, then we need to first off have a discussion around expectations. So is, you coming into therapy and what we've spoken about so far, what you expected, and what are my expectations of you as a client? Are we on the same page there? So we can first talk about that. But then it is about exploring, okay, what's getting in the way here, right? And again, just how I work, I have no problems referring someone if we just feel like this is not the right fit. So I often talk to my clients about that. If you have a referral, we'll go through that together. So we'll flick through that. And that's just sometimes true because GPs are very rushed for time. And sometimes I read things in the referral and then I ask the client about it and they're like, oh, no, that's not right. And that can just be typos or,
Doctor's handwriting.
Handwriting, lost in translation. So getting clarity around those things.
Yeah.
And then I'm really open it up to my client, right? And it's, what brings you in?
Yeah.
At the time that you made this appointment, what was happening for you? That's really probably the starting point.
Yeah.
In that first session too, your psychologist might ask you to fill out some forms, so just the general forms that you would fill out for any kind of profession or professional or clinician, and then forms where some of you listening might be familiar where you have you had any of these symptoms in the past 2 weeks, and you circle the little boxes for like 0, 1, 2 or 3.
Yeah.
What that does is it provides us with a little bit more, I guess, data. It's not the be all and end all because we want to hear about the experience directly from you, but it gives some data and numbers for us to play with, and particularly in that Medicare mental health care space. So a caveat again with the confidentiality is, and I always check this with clients, it's like, look, you've come in with this care plan. I would like to let your doctor know that we've seen each other today and that we've started using this plan. Is that okay? Most clients are like, yep, no worries. And in that letter, I'll give the breakdown of that data. Right, so the depression score is this, or the anxiety score is that. Part of the Medicare process is then I then have to write another letter after the 6th session, and you need to go back and see your doctor to have a chat about how it's going. And again, in that letter, I'll get you to fill out the circles again, and I'll provide that data, right? Mm-hmm. And it just gives it, as well as that subjective, like this is the presentation, this is what we've worked on, this is what the client is now reporting, like improvements in these areas. We've also got that data and those numbers to reflect that change as well.
Yeah.
And then, so it opens it up to you. And sometimes clients will come in like, I don't know where to start. And it's like, well, how's your day been today? Like, what's been happening today? Or again, at the time that you made this appointment, at the time that you got this referral with your GP, what was happening at that time?
Yeah. Can I ask you a question? If you have a legal issue, like say you've done something and you want to go talk to a psychologist about it, should you be careful of what information you give in case it gets subpoenaed?
I think that's a really good question, and it's a really good point to raise with your psych from the outset.
Yeah.
So every psychologist should be bringing up that confidentiality statement with you.
Yeah.
Right, and that is your opportunity. You can ask at any point. Confidentiality is not just a one and done. Right? I always say it to my clients at any point. If you want to come back and talk about confidentiality, the limits to that, any of these things, we can always review it.
Yeah.
But right from that get-go, I would be having a chat about that.
Yeah.
And being like, there's legal implication. I know that there's legal implications here for me.
Yeah.
If I was to say ABC or XYZ, what are your implications with that?
Yeah.
And having that hypothetical conversation.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. You could be like, hypothetically.
If I told you that I killed someone, would you have to break your...
Yes.
Yeah, right. But like, what about lesser crimes?
Yeah, it's a good question. So drugs is a really common one. Clients who are really resistant or hesitant to say that they've been using. Depends. This is, the classic, my poor students, if they listen to this, the classic psychology, it depends. Look, as an example, I had a client who a long time ago where a lot of our work focused in on marijuana use.
Yeah.
I knew that the service that he was coming in through knew about that, and he had a caseworker. I'm like, okay, so we all know this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right? And there's a bit of a legal implication here that the police also know this.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Marijuana, it's not good. I'm not going to sit here and be like, oh, yeah, no worries.
Yeah.
But it's not heroin.
That's just my sort of point,
Yeah.
my opinion. He was over 18, right, and we were working on reducing that use.
Yeah.
That was the point of the sessions.
Yeah.
If, I guess what's another example, if you're dealing heroin to a minor...
Yeah.
and you tell me about a drug syndicate, I'm probably going to have to break that.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Or if someone's like, I plan on murdering my neighbour.
Yeah.
Their music's too loud, then you have to.
Yes. And that falls into the harm to someone else. So it's harm to self. So if I perceive that this client is actively suicidal, right, I have to keep them safe.
Yeah.
Right? I have to breach that confidentiality because keeping them alive is the objective. It's the key point. And kind of how I say it to my clients is that if you're not here, I can't work with you.
Yeah.
So that's the priority. Like there's a bit of a risk escalation here that becomes a priority. But it's also harm to someone else.
Yeah.
And whether that's an adult, right? If you're, and I have a chat about it, right? Sometimes clients say things and you're like, is that just like a phrase that you're using to, it's kind of like swearing, like you swear because you want to give emphasis.
Yeah. Being like, oh, I want to kill them. But like,
Yes.
Yeah.
But as a psychologist, I would clarify that.
Yeah.
You know,
Like, are you actually going, or is this a turn of
You just
phrase?
say-
is this a phrase? Yeah.
Yeah.
Like, because you're frustrated.
Yeah.
You know, and maybe there's a bit of regulation that we can work on there. But yeah, if it's, I have concerns that you're going to harm someone else.
Yeah.
I know that I have to keep them safe. And then under 18 is a whole different thing. And it's very tricky too because it depends state to state what the laws are.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So complicated.
There's another tab that's open in your brain during this session.
You're really answering the what am I paying for?
Yeah.
It's very complicated.
Yeah, so through a session, I guess some other things that will happen, your psychologist will take notes, right? So if they're sitting there scribbling, right? Those notes, again, are confidential. They stick to those bounds of confidentiality. You can also ask your psychologist what they are writing down if you're curious about that. Like it's a shared sort of space. But also too, as the client, you can take notes. I think sometimes people or clients feel silly about that. Like, oh, can I take notes? It's like, absolutely you can. You know, I have clients who bring in their notebook of the things that they've written down in between sessions because it's really common. People come in, they're like, oh, I had this thing to tell you that linked to our last session and I just can't remember it. Oh my goodness. And they spend 50 minutes trying to work out what it was.
I go in with so many notes. I just have notes open on my thing and I'm like, write it down every time because otherwise I would just forget.
If things aren't written down, they leave my brain instantly.
Yeah, so there's a bit of a balance there too. Sometimes I will ask my clients not to take notes.
Yeah.
Right. So that is more so, I guess, if I'm working with someone and this is just pure generalization, but you know, they're perfectionistic A++, and that links into their presentation.
Yeah.
I'm like, hey, let's maybe not make some notes. And they're like, oh, I can't do it. I'm like, that's part of the psychotherapy. That's part of the exposure
This is your
therapy.
homework.
This is your homework, is to not take the notes, to live your life and see where this discussion comes up and the epiphanies will come.
Yeah.
As you experience what it is like to let go of control.
Yeah.
Right. So again, sometimes and again, I always explain that to my clients, my process.
Yeah.
To fill them in as to what's happening. But yeah, from the outset, like if you want to take a few dot points or whatnot, that's fine.
Yeah.
Like that's fine for you to do and bringing those in. Then from there, you know, the sessions thereafter, again, they won't have that confidentiality spiel at the start, but it'll be either the psychologist kicks it off, right? So I tend to just kick it off by like, since last session, like tell me what's been happening.
Yeah.
Because that tends to drill down into what we're going to talk about anyways. And then from there, it really depends. So as a psychologist, I will have a plan, but if the client brings new information that then changes that case formulation, then I adjust on the spot. I'm like, okay, this strategy and this thing that we're going to talk about, that's good for next session, but right now we need to work on this piece.
Yeah.
There's a thing in psychology called immediacy. Sometimes if you don't work on the thing in the immediate time frame, then it's kind of lost.
Yeah.
You can come back to it, but when a client is in that feeling state, I'm like, okay,
Now's the time.
now is the time, that this is the time that we have to work on this.
Yeah.
Because I can't just ask you to come in and, hey, can you start crying so we can work on that thing, right?
Remember when you were sad?
If we get to a point and you're crying, I'm like, I want to work with you in this space. This is the work. Yep.
Yeah.
How often do you say, tell me about your childhood?
I was going to say that. That's what I was going to ask.
Classic. I probably phrase it differently.
Yeah.
The reason that psychologists ask about your childhood, your upbringing, your early years is because, again, depending on what your current presentation is or concerns or what you're bringing into the session, sometimes our experiences in early life are somewhat mapping onto your experience now. The best way I explain it to clients is that if you think about when you're 4 or 5 years old, right, or even when you've just come out of the womb. I was talking about this to one of my students who had a baby. His partner had a baby in the semester break, and I said, it just astounds me that a baby is born. They have to learn how the world works.
Yeah.
Like they've been in the womb for 9 months, just doing their thing, and that might sound silly to some people, but I'm like, that just blows my mind that you now have to learn how to life. Anyways. So throughout that process, though, you're like a sponge. Right? As a little kid, you're like, okay, so 1 + 1 = 2. You're starting to learn this idea around play and what that's like, but you're also starting to learn about consequence, right? So if I do this thing, or if I observe this person does that thing or says that thing, this is what happens. And that's how I feel. What then happens is that even as adults, we have our prefrontal cortex, depending on our age, is fully formed, right? By the time all of us get to 30, that guy in there is fully formed. And we can think about things really logically and objectively. The emotional part of self is often still made up of our 5-year-old self, our 8-year-old self, our 12-year-old self. Oftentimes I'm working with my clients and I'm like, just pause for a moment. I'm like, that feeling, like describe that feeling that you're having right now as we talk about this. And then they'll tell me about it. I'm like, can you pinpoint for me, and you might not be able to, the first time that you felt this? And they're like, yeah, it was, I'm just making this up, but when I was 8 years old and I saw my parents have a massive blow up for the first time. Like that puts me back in that space. Now, again, we're never demonizing or blaming parents. Parents are doing the best that they can. There's plenty of manuals on how to be a parent, but like I can only imagine
read them.
The lived experience is like something else, right? But yeah, that's why we often ask about your childhood. People talk about like attachment styles. That's, I guess probably as of late, social media, everyone's talking about attachment styles, whether they're right or not, whatever. But attachment styles are really formed in your early childhood.
It makes sense.
When you cried, did your caregivers come to you? Well, when you cried, were you just left, right? And when I say left, not just left for like 5 minutes. Like, again, if anyone's listening thinking, oh, my God, I've left my child. But I mean left, like gone, abandoned, right? So that's where we start to learn those innate feelings. That's why we ask about childhood, because, again, a lot of that comes up.
It shapes them.
It shapes, yeah. And I say to people, it's like, you might now be 30, whatever, but your 5-year-old self, whether you can, vividly remember it or not, every single age is still with you.
Yeah.
Like I'm still Emma at 5 years old, 11 years old, 18 years old. Like all of those lived experiences and those parts of self are still there.
Yeah.
Right. And they're still operating. We don't necessarily just want to get rid of it and go, oh, well, it doesn't matter. Like I'm this age now, just flick that off.
Yeah.
We still want that in there because it's a still valid experience.
Yeah.
This question's a pivot.
Okay.
You know how you were just saying that our prefrontal lobe is fully developed at 30?
Oh, yeah, it depends, male, female, females before males.
Do we tend to be more, like from a science perspective, more logical and emotionally regulated past that age because of that?
Are we more regulated?
Or is it just like lived experience and learning to be that?
Absolutely. Like I've had some 18-year-old clients where I sit back and I think about their lived experience so far and what they're currently going through, and it just blows my mind as to how they manage with it. I'm just like, and then I could have a 50-year-old going through the same experience and there's no regulation skills there. So it's not so much that we become, I think we do, like we become more mature potentially over time.
But it's more of a skill that you hone.
Yeah, absolutely. And your lived experiences can skill that up for you too.
Yeah.
That was just a random thought that popped into my head. It's just like I was just reflecting on, I was recently reflecting on myself and how emotionally regulated I am now and how that wasn't always the case when I was in my mid-20s and beyond. And is this, it just flicked into my brain like, I have worked on that.
I was going to say you've worked on yourself a lot as well.
But I was like, is there also some sort of like brain science that clicked into place and it's like, you can handle it now.
Now you're emotionally intelligent.
You can handle it now.
I think there's a couple of things there too. Like I guess as we get older, we've had more experiences of where we've been in situations and then we didn't regulate. And then in hindsight, we're like, oh, kind of blew up about that, or that wasn't, I kind of overreacted. That was a bit ridiculous. And just ourselves, without any other input, then when we're put back in a similar scenario that evokes similar emotions, we're like, oh, this is like that time 5 years ago. So this time I'm going to do it differently.
Yeah. So
and
you've had a bit of trial and error.
Yeah. And it's through that trial and error. And for most people, and again, I'm generalizing here, as you get older, you've had more experience of trial and error. Right? And if you're putting in that side work where you're continuing to hone yourself and develop as a person, right, it comes to a point where you're like, oh, wow, I'm so much more regulated than 5 years ago or whatnot. If I go back to the 18-year-old example though, if an 18-year-old has potentially lived, I don't know, I guess the amount of lived experiences that a 50-year-old would get, right, just through circumstances, the cards that they were dealt, right? That's really where I sit down, I'm like, wow, this is like incredible what you've had to work through in that time. I think too with the brain side of things, I remember once some parents asking me, they're like, I think they were talking about their kids packing the dishwasher and doing their chores. And this was obviously in amongst other things that were happening. But they're like, how is it that our 10-year-old daughter can understand this, can understand consequence, that if you don't pack the dishwasher, then you've got nothing to eat with.
Yeah.
But our 15-year-old son just doesn't get it. And I'm like, look, there's plenty of things that were potentially going on, but also too, typically a female's brain will develop quicker and earlier than a male's, right? And again, this is really generalising and a little bit of stereotyping, but this is where we typically see males taking more risk-taking behaviour in their late teenage, early 20s, right, compared to females. Because, again, there's a lot of reasons and a lot of context and circumstances, but it is also because the brain, that part of the brain it's not fully developed yet. Right. So that can, again, at everyone, there would be individual variations within that too.
Yeah.
I think it's really funny that we say, oh, we've got to try and keep an episode to a certain length. And then we get Emma on and we just ask her all of these rogue questions.
And all of your answers are so good.
And we go way off script and start asking her so much random shit.
It's all right,
But I'm
guys.
sure this is what all of our listeners are thinking as well.
Yeah, true. How many sessions do people typically need?
It depends. Classic answer. Okay, yeah, but it really does depend. So in my experience,
that makes sense.
My experience, I've had a client where we worked for 4 sessions and we both in the 4th session looked at each other and were like, yeah, we're done here. Like this, it was very solution-focused therapy. She didn't have anyone to talk to about it. Very emotionally switched on, like regulation. There was no regulation issues or whatnot. It was this circumstance that needed a sounding board and we worked on it and we both sat again at the end of the 4th and went, yep.
And she's obviously very ready to do the work.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep. In comparison, I've had clients that I've worked with for up to 4 years.
Yeah.
And again, that's not to say that they're not doing the work. They're doing the work.
But they just need more time.
Yeah, and I can remember, the end of that 4 years where I had a break for about 6 months for seeing clients just to give myself a break. And it was really at that point that we stopped and we were like, okay, like, can you tell me, about the past 4 years? Like, that reflection piece of who you were 4 years ago, where you're at now, what you've learned. And it's really those times that when we stop and reflect on it, clients just being like, I'm just a completely different person now. Like, and they've got the skills and the tools and they're equipped and they're ready to go. But again, given their circumstances and or their presentation, what's going on, that there needs that longevity in the sessions, right? This is not things, again, that I just give a solution to and go, how does that sound? And you go, yeah, great, woohoo, get on with my life. It's stuff that is constantly happening. There's a constant flow there, right? There's this ebb and flow of when things are working and when they're not. And I guess without going into too much detail about their presentation, it needs that longevity of the work. I guess how many sessions, if you look at like a mental health care plan, right? So a mental health care plan in 1 year, you're given 10 sessions.
Yeah.
And that's typically because I guess they looked at it from a research perspective and they went, on average, if we give people 10 sessions, that's a good amount of work. Maybe then if they support that either side with a couple of sessions themselves, right? That's a, 1 session a month for a year, right?
Yeah.
That could help most people. And I would also say too that no matter how many sessions you have or how often, some therapy is better than no therapy. Right? So if you've got concerns about like, I can't afford, and I get it, like I can't afford it in amongst everything else, like even with the mental health care plan, it's sitting down with that psychologist in the first session and going, look, mate, like I can probably only do this every couple of months.
Yeah.
Right. And I think a good psychologist will work with that. And they'll go, okay, like ideally I'd have you in here every fortnight. That's okay. But giving the psychologist that information, we can then work with that.
Yeah.
Right? We might be giving you more sort of work to do, I guess, in between, yeah, depending on the presentation.
That makes sense.
Do any psychologists, or this might be too random, but like do many psychologists do payment plans? Or?
No, it's not common.
Okay.
Yeah. Also too, because there's an ethical limit to that.
Yeah.
That if you've paid up front or you're on a payment plan and you're locked in for 6 months and then we get 2 months in and you're like, oh, I don't think Emma's the psych for me.
Yeah.
But shit, I've paid all this money.
Yeah.
That's just unethical.
Yeah. So
Yeah, right.
So it's usually most psychologists will be is you pay on the day.
Yeah.
Yeah. And some psychologists will have the high caps Medicare machine there.
Yeah.
They can process your private health or your Medicare claim on the spot. So like at the doctors, you get it back straight away.
Yeah.
For me, because I'm an online only telehealth provider, I get my clients to pay ahead of the session and I give them an invoice afterwards and they claim it themselves through the MyGov app or their private health. So it really depends. But, I think that's that collaboration piece with a psychologist right from the get-go, or a couple of sessions in, like just for my own sort of knowledge and planning, like how many sessions are we potentially looking at here? And this is really where too, like again, this is my approach. I really work in with my client. So if my client is also seeing a psychiatrist, I'm like, hey, when are you seeing a psychiatrist next? Do you find that to be a good touch point for you? Like where you feel that you've then got some strategies from them and you've got a plan moving forward. Maybe we don't double up then. Let's not see each other in the same week when you're seeing your psychiatrist. Let's spread this out. Let's work collaboratively. Also to the spaces I've worked within like weight loss surgery, it's like, hey, do you want to double up and see your dietitian and me in the same week? Do you want to split that up? Right? Because again, the nutritionist and the psychiatrist is not, or the dietitian is not doing the same as what I'm doing. But you're getting support. And sometimes
might be beneficial.
You can start to spread sessions out a little bit in that way.
I think that that's such a good piece of advice to talk about whether or not like you can commit to how many sessions or whether you need a big gap in between in your financial situation. I would have never thought of that, to be able to get, like for you to be able to tailor the service that you provide so that they can get the most out of it. That's really good advice for our listeners.
It is.
But I think it's the way, again, this is the way I work. I can't talk to other psychs, but the psychs that I've worked alongside with do the same thing, and it's money shouldn't be a barrier to therapy. And that's where really working, as we're saying, collaboratively, mapping out a plan. Also too, when I've got some clients where we work together for quite a long time and we're at a point now where it's like, hey, like you go and do that for 3 months and we book a session for 3 months. And if, in the weeks leading up to that session, you feel that you need a little bit more time, you just let me know. I think always leaving with a session booked, no matter where that is. Because if you don't have a session booked,
you might not get in.
And then you try and come back, right? The book could be full.
Yeah.
Right? And it's, just appreciating too that the way in which like many allied health professionals work is if I don't have my appointment book filled, I don't get paid. So I can't hold spot for you and just go, if you want it, it's there. It's like, no, you make a time and I hold it for you. And we can always reschedule and shuffle that around.
That's good advice too.
Very good.
Yeah, so again, it's just that chat with your psych. And again, some therapies just take a longer time. Right? It's not come in and fix it. And again, sometimes, some of my clients, I'm like, that is the issue, is that you want things fixed. And this situation that you're in is not going to be fixed. And that's the work.
And so just another question on that. So clients are kind of in control of how much or how little they come. So like you might say, I would love to see you fortnightly, but they might say, I can only afford to come every 6 weeks. So you do have control over that in case people have the misconception that they're going to go, I just need to see you every week. And if price is a barrier.
It depends. The caveat is it depends on the presentation and the therapy. So mostly in the cases that I'm working with and the therapy approach is that I'll give you a reason and a rationale as to why I think every fortnight, every 3 weeks, every 4 weeks, every 6 weeks, whatever it is, right? Then you come to me and be like, okay, well, this is what I can do. But there are some, caveats where the type of therapy needs to be back to back. It needs to be to get the therapy to work.
Right.
So if I think of something like DBT, dialectical behaviour therapy, it needs to be pretty consistent, right? It needs to be that consistent touch point because DBT, a lot of that work is around distress and distress tolerance, emotion regulation, interpersonal skills, mindfulness. There are a lot of group therapy sessions in DBT. And if you're just not attending, you're not going to get the traction with it. And again, often DBT courses are highly expensive, but you're often offered a psychologist who's on call 24/7 because that is the nature of the work and the presentation. It requires that. So it's, sometimes that can feel quite intense, but if you're ready to go down that path, it might be that like, no, this is the structure. We actually need the structure here. Because sometimes if a client goes too long, we lose the traction. We kind of start to lose the work.
Yeah, that's fair. I heard someone the other day on the internet and they were saying, and it just reminded me when you said caveat, they said, and the caveat is, and I was like, I don't think that's right. But I wasn't like 100% sure. Like it really baffled me. So our last official question, and I think You shared with me in the episode planning that you often get asked by people when they find out
This is so funny.
that you're a psychologist, they ask if you can read their mind.
Yeah.
Can you?
No. I think
That's so funny.
I'm kind of used to it now, but like when I was first studying psychology, and I don't know, this was at the pub with people who were intoxicated, so maybe that's where it comes from. They're like, oh, can you read my mind? And I'm like, no, like if I could read your mind, I'd be rich. Like I wouldn't be here. Like,
You'd be like, I feel like when you were 8, this happened to you. And they'd be like, oh my God, yes.
yes. So
That's exactly what a psychic does.
I know, that's what I mean. If you were psychic, you could
If you were a psychic psychologist,
yeah, that's what I mean.
there's a real niche there.
yeah, and I think that's probably where the misconception comes from is psychologist and psychic. They sound similar, and I think that's maybe where it comes through.
Well, those words are so hard to spell.
Oh my God, I cannot. I can't spell psychiatrist. I have learned I can't spell pneumonia. I can't spell psychologist.
I can't help you with that. That means just give it to someone else. I guess to give a bit of clarity, so that mediums and clairvoyants are both types of psychics. So these fields have to do with like telepathy and talking to people on the other side who have passed and being that, I guess, again, that medium for which that message comes through, giving readings, and then they often deem that they have abilities beyond the 5 senses, right? Mm-hmm. So that's kind of the Google definition of being a psychic. Again, it's probably obvious, but the big difference is that psychology is an evidence-based therapy.
It's real. No.
It's, I don't know, like, look, if seeing a medium or seeing a clairvoyant or whatnot is your thing and you get benefit out of it and it works for you, okay, like that's your choice. Again, a little bit like seeing a chiropractor, a physiotherapist, an osteo, an exercise physiologist. Like everyone will have their differing opinion as to what works for them. But in regards to mental health, again, everyone has mental health.
I was going to say, I don't know if you take your mental health issues to your psychic.
Correct, right? It's your mental health, again, your well-being, your interpersonal relationships. A psychologist will come from an evidence-based approach, right? Your psychologist is not making it up, right? It's stemming from a therapy.
Yeah.
And again, we're trained professionals in, helping people make up their own decisions. So that's another thing. Sometimes people go, what do you think I should do? And it's like, I can't tell you what to do.
I've said that to my psychologist before. I've been like, can you just tell me what to do? Because that's my problem is I can't decide what to do.
Yeah, and it's, we aren't trained to give advice. We're not advice givers. It's okay, on the one hand, you're telling me this. On the other hand, you're telling me that. What do you think? Right. And again, the client will still be like, well, can't you just tell me?
Yeah.
And it's like, no, that's not my job. I want you to make the decision. I want it to come from you.
Do people ever ask, what would you do?
Yes.
I've done that too. I've been like, if you can't tell me what to do, can you tell me what you would do in that situation?
You're just like, we're not talking about me.
Yeah, I'm like, look, it's really lovely that you want to come in and pay money and talk about me, but that's not what the session's for. And again, I don't have that lived experience.
Yeah.
And even if I did, even if you're sitting there and you're talking about an argument that you had with your partner, and then I'm like, oh, I've had an argument with my partner too, and then you ask me for advice, my partner's not your partner.
Yeah.
And you are not me. So even though we're having
not applicable.
arguments, it's completely different, right? Yeah. And it's not about your psychologist having the same lived experience as you. Sometimes that's a little bit of a misconception. It's that, how will a psych help me if they haven't had the lived experience? And it's like, I don't need to have the lived experience.
Yeah, because you studied it for years and years.
I've studied it, and I want you, I'm the quote unquote expert. We can't call ourselves experts, but I'm the expert in human behavior and psychology. You're the expert in your own lived experience. And when we combine that, now sometimes lived experience, it can help people feel, I guess, a sense of relatedness. And there's definitely psychologists that have had a lived experience of what their clients are presenting with. But that psychologist would be working very, very hard to make sure that there's no what we call countertransference, which is when in the psychology session, things start to come up for the psychologist. So a psychologist with the lived experience has to work really hard to kind of dampen and soften that noise that's happening for them to be able to provide that care for that client.
Yeah.
So, it might mean that you can kind of talk the same language because you've had that lived experience. But again, you just have to be really careful that, having lived experience is not the be all and end all, because I want you to tell me
what it's like for you.
What it's like for you and your experience. And ultimately, I can't read minds. I can get you to talk about your mind and we can work together. And it's all about, feeling, not getting rid of just the dysfunctional part of your life, but leading a more self-determined and fulfilling and meaningful life is ultimately what, as psychs, is what we want.
Yeah. I love that. Is there anything else you would like to share with someone that is thinking they might like to go and see someone but still feels a bit hesitant?
I think first off, like taking those practical steps that we've spoken about today, knowing that, again, after a couple of sessions, if you feel this is not the right fit for you, that is part of the psychology process. And I know that can feel like a lot of heavy lifting. It's like, oh, I finally got myself to see a psych and I don't really think they're the fit for me. It's part of the process, right? It's kind of like shopping. You go to one shop and you try something on and you're like, oh, it doesn't fit or don't like it. You go to the next one. Not to say that shopping's like psychology, but, the analogy is there.
Got to shop for your psychologist.
Yeah, you got to shop around.
Yeah.
And I think about the clients who come in and I'm like, oh, have you seen a psychologist before? And they're like, oh, yeah, I saw a psych a couple of years ago, but I didn't really like this that they said or this approach or this was the issue. And then we worked together for however long. And at the end, they're like, oh, I'm so glad I finally found someone. At the time, it felt so difficult to have to go and explain my story to someone else again. But it was really, really worth it. So I think just normalizing that is part of the process. And, hey, you can get it right from the get-go. You find someone, you're like, great, this is a great fit. I don't have to question it. And also too, sometimes you work with a psychologist and then it gets to a point where it's time to see another psych.
Yeah.
That psychologist has given you all that they know. You've done all the work that you together can possibly do. And it's now time for you, like you've evolved and it's time for you to go and see someone else. Because a different psychologist can work from a different perspective or give you a different type of therapy, right? So it's okay to change who you work with. I think as well as the practical things and normalizing that process, it's exploring that hesitation. Right. So on the one hand, why am I thinking that this is good for me?
Yeah.
What is it that points me that I should really, quote unquote, I should really see someone? Why?
Yeah.
And explore that. On the other hand, what is the thing that is holding you back? And that could, again, it could be a logistical thing of like, I just don't know where to look, right? So you've got some ideas from today. Or all the way through to it's like, I just don't know if I want to sit and relive this.
Yeah.
And talk through this and go back to that point. And I think if it's more edging towards that, I would, again, it's not easy, but I would potentially say that to a psychologist.
Yeah.
It's taken me a lot to come here because I actually don't want to have to talk. I'm sick of talking about it.
Yeah.
And they will work with you.
Yeah.
You'll probably talk about other things for sessions, right?
Yeah.
And other avenues, right? It takes time for you. Psychologists are not expecting you to come in and just, here it is.
Here's my trauma.
Here's my trauma. Here I am. Again, if you want to do that, that's great and that's fine.
I do that to people for
I was
free.
going to say, that was me. That's how I approach it. I go in and I word vomit all of my issues all over them.
But, if you go in and you're like, there's these things, but I don't know if I really want to talk about it, and your psychologist is not going to sit there and, challenge that off the bat. Like for me, I'd be like, okay, cool. Like what are some other things that we can work on? Because until you feel that there's a sense of connection and rapport, I can't expect you to talk about those things.
Yeah.
And you don't want to push them into something they're not ready to talk about.
Exactly. And I think, again, just the way that I work, if we're sort of getting on with sessions and you've alluded to this topic, and we still haven't spoken about it. And for me, I'm going, this is the missing piece.
Yeah.
I tell my client that. I'm like, hey, I'm just wondering if I can voice my thoughts around this topic of your relationship with so-and-so, or whatever it may be. I'm kind of feeling we're at a point where that information there would really help me in progressing us forward. But I also know that this is a space that is particularly sensitive to you and that you've voiced from the outset that you don't want to explore at this point. Yeah. I'm wondering where you're at with that right now, right? And sometimes clients are like, yeah, actually, I'm ready to talk about it. Sometimes clients are like, oh, no, I need to think about it. Sometimes clients are like, oh, I want to go home and write you a letter about it. I'm like, okay, cool.
Yeah.
Or no, I'm not ready to. I feel that I'm getting benefit. My anxiety is going down. My sleep is better. We're working on those things. I just don't want to go there. Yep. Okay, cool, great.
We'll just, put it on the shelf for now.
Yeah.
This is another random thought that just popped into my head. Are most people's issues related to other people or relationships?
Yeah, I would say that there's always, if it's not outright, there's sort of this tenet or this space for it. Yeah, for sure. And I think that, some of it is most definitely it's interpersonal relationships, whether they're past or present or relationship that they want.
Yeah.
The ones where it's not outrightly, that's what's going on, like it's with someone else, there's usually something, another sphere of it happening in their life where they have a poor relationship or something. And, I kind of sometimes, it's probably pretty inappropriate, but I joke with my students, I'm like, it'd be really great if we were just these isolated islands of people and we just were here, but we would just need anybody else, right? But that void would probably be filled with your own problems, right? But we're social creatures and beings. And yeah, definitely that's, we can, and again, that just kind of makes me laugh because, I have female clients being like, why does my husband just understand this? And then I have male clients being like, why doesn't my wife just understand this? And I'm like, because you're from different planets, whether you believe that or not, but we are wired differently. And often that we just feel like we're headbutting. Like, why does it? And again, even if we're not in that, male-female relationship where it's someone else looking at the same, sunrise, but you're looking through a different set of lenses. So you're seeing different things. And that's often what I say to people. I'm like, you're so determined in what you see. Like you're seeing this experience and you've got your glasses on and seeing that. And I remember saying to someone else, explaining this to them and just saying, you can explain it to someone else to the nth degree and what your experience is like. But even if that person has had the same lived experience as you, so this is really common with siblings, right? They've grown up in the same household. I'm like, you are two different people. You are never, ever going to have 100% same experience to that other person. Now, from the outset, you'll just think that. It's like, well, I was in the same house as them, so how did they not see what I saw? And it's like, because you're you and they're them, and that's right. And it's just where we could get quite deep and philosophical about it, but like you are you and you are going to look at things and just see it a completely different way. And you're going to bang your head on the desk or the door or the wall. Why can't this person see it?
Yeah.
That's so funny with siblings. Like I think that there's not a person that I'm less like on this planet than my brother.
And I always explain it, particularly to either the eldest or the youngest, because sometimes that will come up of like, like my older sister, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, how many more years has your older sister been on this planet than you? And then they're like, oh, she's a bit older, like 8 years. I'm like, so she's got 8 years of experience on this planet with this dynamics and these relationships that you will never have.
And you're at different ages when you're experiencing the things.
And I'm not saying that discredit your experience and that your sister is right. She could be very well wrong. Like, I'm not here to judge that, but she's got 8 years.
Yeah.
Difference.
That's why she's so bossy and controlling and gives you so much advice that you don't need.
Right, and that could be it.
I'm the older sister.
Yeah, but just that lived experience, right? A life without you.
Yeah.
Now, whether that's good, bad, whatever, I'm not getting into that. But for so long, that person was them. Yeah. And then you've come along. That's going to change the dynamic. And that's not blaming anyone. I think sometimes, just to go back, to what we were originally talking about, it's a lot of the issues and concerns that sometimes people have is to do with other people, and it's acceptance that yes, we can modify and we can work with people in different ways and whatnot. But at the end of the day, you're different people, and to a degree, there's a bit of an acceptance that needs to be about that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you, Emma. This is brilliant, as always. Thank you for fielding all of our questions. Please remind everyone where they can find you, and we'll pop it in the show notes as well.
Cool. So my practice is called Emotion Psychology. So you can find my website, emotionpsychology.com. You can also find me on Instagram.
We are sure that you have found value in this episode, and we hope that it helps you take the step to go and see a psychologist if you've been thinking about it for a while. I can really speak to how beneficial it is and would encourage anyone else to do the same.
As we said at the start of the episode, we believe that mental health is the most important thing. Remember that work, that event, other people's feelings, that commitment that you said you could do, all of those things don't matter as much as your mental health. Look after you first and foremost.
Have an amazing week, and we'll be back next Monday at 4 a.m. wherever you get your podcasts.
Thanks, Em.
No worries. Bye.